Nehemiah chapter number 6. And we're starting in verse 15 tonight. We're finishing up chapter 6. I'm going to give you an intro to chapter 7 tonight of the book of Nehemiah. Now remember who Nehemiah was. He was the cupbearer to the king. He was a captive, or he was in captivity in the Persian palace. And he was there as a slave, of course. But he had become a good friend of the king and the queen because he was the one that was the taster for everything that the king and the queen had. So they became well acquainted with him. They knew him very well. And I believe that they had become friends over the years and that God had made that so in order that Nehemiah would one day be ready to ask to go back to Jerusalem and to get that burden that he got. He would need the strength of the Lord and the blessings of the Lord to do so. And the Lord did bless him and gave him the desire of his heart to go back and to help his people rebuild. Now, Nehemiah wasn't there to work on the temple, he was there to work on the walls. It was important to get the walls built up. Why? Remember, you had a city. There were 12 gates around. I'm not doing 12, I'm just making an illustration. There's 12 gates around. However, all of these gates were what? Burnt. So there's no gates. There's no blocking of the entrance or no security. Most of the walls have been torn down almost to the ground in most places. All right, so the walls have been torn down. The gates were burnt and torn off the hinges and dragged out. Most of them had been dragged off and used for other purposes, just like the stones that were there. A lot of people came and stole the stones that had been carved, especially for the temple, and carried them off for their own building projects. So Jerusalem is in pretty bad shape. After the removal, this city was almost leveled, you might say. So Nehemiah receives that report from some friends that had gone and visited family there in Jerusalem. Ezra had been there 10 years, but with all his work and efforts being concentrated on the temple and having it restored, he didn't have time to do the city walls. So God raised up Nehemiah to be in that place at that time, to be there in Shushan, the palace, and there he presented his petition to come back and to begin to build the walls of Jerusalem. Now, we've seen him go through different conflicts, through different challenges. We've seen him go through enemies that were trying to scare him, intimidate him, frighten him. They're tried every trick in the book, and they're still trying. Even now, they're still trying. Now let's look at verse 15. This is where the point is. And look what it says. So the wall was what? Finished in the 25th day of the month, Elul. Now notice how long it took. How many days? In 52 days. How many is that? 52. 52 days they completed the wall. Now think about that. Remember, most of the wall had been torn down at least to about knee high. The rubble was all in the streets where they'd been torn down. If the rocks hadn't been carried off, the good ones hadn't been carried off, they're laying all around in the streets. So remember now, Nehemiah has a burden to do this work, and he in turn incites all the inhabitants of Jerusalem to begin building. And then we find out in the chapter preceding, in chapter 5, that people have begun to cry out to Nehemiah and said, hey, they're charging us a ridiculous interest. They're indenturing our sons and our daughters for taxes and for food. Remember that was one of the conflicts that Nehemiah had with the nobles who were making money off of their impoverished state. And Nehemiah put him out in front of the congregation, all the nobles, and said it should not be so. He called them out for it. Well, we're going to see in the next few verses how they're going to turn on him again. You see, he embarrassed them publicly, so what can you expect? There's going to be some kind of retaliation. So we're going to see that in the next verses, but notice Nehemiah doesn't let that stop the work. He's been invited several times, at least 5 times, he's been invited by the enemy to come meet in some village somewhere and try to work a deal. He wouldn't go. Why? Because he says, I'm doing a work and I can't stop. The work must be done. And he was doing a work for the Lord, and it's obvious if you did all of that in 52 days, God has blessed that work. Now remember, we had goldsmiths and silversmiths and jewelers and all kinds of nobles and politicians and all kinds of people that didn't do work with their hands, but they're doing it. It had ladies that were building on the wall too. And that was unheard of, that ladies would do that kind of work, but they did. God was using them and gave them the motivation and gave them the abilities and the strength they needed every day to go out and lay those stones back in that wall. So while they're doing that, of course, the opposition comes around, the enemy threatens, so they have to put guards out. They had a set people for a guard every day and a set people of guard every night. And Nehemiah had a guy with a horn beside him that whenever the enemy was sighted or there was an alarm, he would blow that trumpet or horn, and people would come running and assemble to fight the enemy. That was Nehemiah's smart way of keeping watch, and that scared the enemy off from trying to attack them. But now notice the enemy is going to try another tactic from within. Don't recall last week we looked at how that a false prophet had tried to lure Nehemiah into locking himself in the temple because there was an assassination attempt that he had heard of, and he wanted to protect Nehemiah. All right? Now, this was a false prophet that was saying this. And the country was still cursed with false prophets during that time. But Nehemiah wasn't falling for that because, number one, he would be a coward to go and hide inside the temple and lock himself in. Number two, it was no doubt an ambush that somebody would be in that temple waiting to kill him when he went in there. So he knew better, and he trusted in the Lord, and he was trusting in the Lord the whole time, and God was protecting him and using him and helping him to finish this work in 52 days. So he's in the middle of his enemies. He's got enemies without, and he's got enemies within. So now the wall is finished in 52 days. Now there's no big fanfare. There's no big ceremony. There's no trumpets and music playing. It's just noted here that it's done. Nehemiah did exactly what God purposed him to do, enabled him to do, and he completed it as God had provided. So only God could have done that work in that amount of time. If you stop and think about it, if you build a wall, it takes a little while to build a wall. But if you're repairing a wall that was torn down, it's going to take twice as long because you have to clean up. You have to get all that stuff out of your way. And that's one of the things that hasn't quite been done yet, and we'll see that they continue to have to clean up the city. They continue to have to remove the rubble, and they continue to have to get everything cleaned up in the city. Because when Babylon left, Nebuchadnezzar's crew got done, wasn't nothing straightened out. It was all razed to the ground. All right, now notice what it says in verse 17. Well, let's go 16. I'll lift that one out. And it came to pass when all our enemies heard thereof, and all the heathen that were about us saw these things, they were much cast down in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was wrought of our God. What's that telling you? God had a testimony. Even to the heathen, they realized that this work could have been done by nobody but the God of Israel. They realized that. And that's a witness against them in the day of judgment when they stand before God and say, well, why didn't you repent and accept God as your God? And they would come up with some excuse, but they saw it with their own eyes how God had accomplished this great work right in front of them. So they're cast down. I mean, in other words, they're ashamed. They've not been able to stop the work. They've not been able to defeat the work. They've not been able to assassinate Nehemiah. They've not accomplished anything that they wanted to. So they're going to try another tactic again. Verse 17, moreover, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters unto Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came unto them. Now, why do you think the nobles are sending letters to Tobiah? They're telling or tattling or gossiping on Nehemiah. All right? Whatever Nehemiah said or whatever Nehemiah did, they would report it to the man outside, and that was Tobiah. He's one of the enemy. Right? Now, Tobiah, notice what it says in verse 18. For there were many in Judah sworn unto him. What's that mean? Sworn unto him. They were followers of him. All right? Because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah, and his son Johanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. All right? So what had happened is one of the nobles' daughters had married Tobiah. So you've got a kinfolk here where one of the Jews had married an enemy. Now, in other words, they're playing footsies with the enemy. Think about that. Here is a person that was a daughter of the nobles that married one of the enemy. Now you think, well, there's no harm in that. Well, think about it. What was Tobiah trying to do to Nehemiah? They was trying to kill him. He was trying to ambush him. He was trying to defeat him. He was trying to do anything he could, politically or physically, to kill Nehemiah. So now the nobles are sending messages, and Tobiah would send messages back about what he's going to do to Nehemiah. And they would say, oh, he said this, and oh, he said that. So they're gossiping and building up hatred for Nehemiah. And it says, and they reported his good deeds before me and uttered my words to him. See that? They were bragging on Tobiah, what a good fella he was. Okay? Now this is the enemy. And they're not getting it in their minds. They're trying to support the enemy who's trying to stop them from building the city, from rebuilding Jerusalem, from reestablishing the temple, and reestablishing the worship of God. This man is definitely anti-Jew. He's definitely anti-Jerusalem. He's definitely anti-Nehemiah. And yet, they're working with him, trying to get Nehemiah out of the picture. And it says here that they uttered my words to him. In other words, there was an exchange of information going back and forth, kind of like the spies during wartime, you know, how there would be spies inside. They'd send spies in. The spies would send little messages back, and they would stay up to date with what's going on with the enemy. Well, that's what the nobles were doing, is they were taking the sides of Tobiah and telling what Nehemiah said, gossiping, and then Tobiah would send word back to say what to say to him. And they began to brag on what Tobiah was doing. And now look at the last part, though. This tells you how much of an enemy it was. Look at the last part of the verse. It says, and Tobiah sent letters to what? Put me in fear. Right? So Tobiah wasn't being honorable, was he? He wasn't doing good things. He was trying any way he could to get Nehemiah killed, defeated, or run off. So that's not the act of a good person. That's not the act of a person that's friendly. That's not the act of a peaceful neighbor. That's an act of war. That's an act of terrorism. That's an act of hatred. To try to put somebody in fear is an act of hatred. Trying to intimidate and bully Nehemiah. But I got news for you. They haven't succeeded yet, and they're not going to succeed in bullying Nehemiah at all. You think about it, God has raised up Nehemiah in that particular position, in that particular place, so that he could have influence with the king and the queen, and so that they would allow him to come back and to do what it is he needed to do, which was build the wall. So God had arranged that through providence to allow Nehemiah to be there, and had arranged for him to come there to Jerusalem, and had arranged for all these people to get a burden in their hearts to do the work of God. And he helped them to do that work. And now here's another one that has a little bit of inroad. The nobles are bragging on him, trying to say, oh, well, good works he's doing, yet the whole time he's sending letters to Nehemiah, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to do this to you, I'm going to do that to you. So what happens when you make peace with the world, it often will cause you trouble. Okay? When you try to make friends with the world will bite you. Remember that. That's like going down to the zoo and climbing into the tiger cage and say, here, kitty, kitty, I want to pet you. What's going to happen? He's going to enjoy your presence, but it's not going to be in a friendly way, is it? No. Or you get in the cage with a bear. We all know what a bear looks like and how big their claws are. You get in there and say, can I have a hug, Bear? He says, sure. I'll give you a hug. Boom. I'm going to eat you while you're here. That's what they were wanting. They wanted to destroy him. And that's what Tobiah is threatening to do to Nehemiah. But Nehemiah doesn't let them stop him. He's not done quite yet. Even though the building project of the wall and the doors and the gates is all done, there's still much to do. So chapter 7 begins that accounting of what he's going to do now. And look what it says. Now it came to pass when the wall was built, underline that, because it had been 52 long days of solid work. Now remember, they were working more than 12-hour days. They were working from sun up till well past dark every day. And God gave them the burden, he gave them the strength and the energy to do so, and it had been completed in 52 days. It said, and I had set up the doors, and the porters and the singers and the Levites were appointed. All right, notice it says, I had set up the doors. What doors is he referring to? The gates. Okay, the gates. And every one of those gates, there were huge gates. And each gate would have a door within it. All right, every gate would be open wide during the day and shut at night. Well, somebody had to open them and shut them. Who would that be? Right there, it tells you their name. No, the porters. See that? They're the gatekeepers. They're the ones that open and shut the gates by night and day. All right, so he appointed them. In other words, they were given a lifetime position here. That was their job, their public job. They were to be there, and they were to watch over the gates. They were to open and shut them. And then it also says that the porters and the singers and the Levites were appointed. The Levites were appointed a course to watch, a course to make sure that the singing was in the proper place and in the proper manner. And he set the Levites in order. And so we see here the setting up of the civil work that needed to be done. Now, of course, remember, they were having trouble building the wall because of the rubble in the streets, and they had worked on that some. The priority, though, was the wall. And many of the houses would now be built as well, because people that were living next to the wall would be working on their section of the wall and working on their houses too. If their wall was attached to their house, they would be working on the wall. When they got that done, they would begin to work on their house. But what's happening now is most of those houses would be finished, but they still had a lot of rubble that they had to get out. So you got the city maintenance crew that had to come out and start working on removing all of the rubble so that people could once again walk up and down the streets and carry out business, etc. So that there be a clean path and a clean way for people to come into the city and come into the temple and worship God freely. Now remember, when the festivals occurred and began to be set up again, remember there was mandatory feasts. When Israel finally got back from captivity after the 70 years, there was mandatory festivals, right? The most important one was the Day of Atonement. Everybody remember that? The Day of Atonement? What is atonement? Okay, let's start back here at that back part there. On the wall there, there's a little blue tub right there. See it? That is the brass laver. Before any sacrifice could be done, the priest had to stop there and wash his feet, because he would have to travel from inside the city to that place right there at the gate and wash his feet first. All right, remember Jesus, when he talked to Peter and the other disciples, it says he took off his clothes and girded himself with a towel and began to wash the feet of the disciples. All right, that's what that's a symbol of, is getting that daily dirt off of you. When you were in sandals and you walk down a dusty street, what's going to get on your feet? Dirt. And that dirt had to be taken care of before you start doing the work. So they would have to stop there, the priest would, and wash his feet. Then he would come over here to the next piece of furniture, which is the brazen altar. In that brazen altar, there was a big grate. Underneath that grate was where the fire was. They built a fire in there in a prescribed manner. And they take that fire and they put that sheep on that brazen altar, slice his throat, and the high priest would catch a cup of blood. All right? He'd take that cup and he'd walk past this piece of furniture right here, the showbread, and he'd walk past the candlelight, the candle, the big candle, what they call that, the menorah. Then he'd come to right here. This was the golden altar. Okay, you see these four horns here? The high priest would take his finger, dip it in that cup, and put a drop of blood on each one of those horns. He also carried with him a coal from the fire where that animal had been sacrificed, carry it and put it right there, and put incense on top of that coal, that hot coal. And what would that do if you put incense on top of a coal? It'd burn it, and there would be smoke that would rise up. Now, anybody know what that symbolizes, that smoke rising up? They're prayers, okay? The prayers rising up before God, right? That's what that symbolized. Then he would stand right here, would be that big, thick curtain that would go all the way across the temple. And remember, it was a handbreadth thick. How thick is that? Huh? So it's about 6 inches thick. That's a big curtain, ain't it? All right? And there's only one place where the high priest could go in. Now, he would have a rope tied on his foot right here. Anybody know why they tied a rope on the high priest's foot? Because nobody could go past this curtain unless they were the high priest. The other priests weren't allowed in there. Only the high priest. Now, what would happen if that high priest had sinned against God and God struck him dead while he was in there? They couldn't go get him. He would defile the temple, though, if he stayed there dead. That's why the rope's on his ankle. That's the practical. See, there's always a practical. So if he didn't come out, and remember he had bells on the bottom of his skirt, his robe, his outfit. He had bells on the bottom of it. And as he's moving around, you'd hear the tinkling of that bell. If they got quiet in there, people would start to listen. I'm not hearing nothing. You hearing anything? No. Uh-oh. Something's happened. So they would drag him by the rope and not go in. They'd drag him by the rope and drag him out. And then carry him out. That happened. But when the high priest got in here first, on that Day of Atonement, he had to come in first and do his own sin offering first. Right? He did it twice. He did 2 sin offerings. One for himself and then the one for the nation. Okay? So he would bring that cup and he'd have a hyssop branch in his hand. And he'd come in here to this Ark of the Covenant and he would sprinkle 7 times all over that Ark of the Covenant that blood. And what that symbolizes is that the blood covered everything, so that when God looked out from between these 2 cherubim, that blood covered his field of view. In other words, he looked through the blood. And their sins would be covered in that blood. But the thing about the Jewish economy is it had to be done every year. But Christ fulfilled that whole process once and for all. He shed his blood, and he took his blood up to heaven the same way, offered it on that golden altar of incense, and then offered his blood and sprinkled it before the ark in heaven. So, what Nehemiah has to do is begin to make preparations for the city cleanup and to begin to help Ezra to finish up everything that needed to be done by getting everything cleaned up, getting the Levites appointed to their jobs and their courses. Now, the Levites were the priests, and they were the daily keepers of the house of God. They were the ones that went around instructing and teaching. They're the ones that helped people understand the scriptures. They had a very important role. Right? Now, where did the Levites come from? Whose house was Aaron from? Whose tribe? From the Levites. The Levites were a tribe. Okay? They were the priests. The priests were chosen out of the Levites. There was Aaron and his sons. And all the descendants thereof were the Levites. So the Levites had what they established, what they call courses. Every so often, they would go down to the temple, and that would be their turn to do whatever chore it was they had to do, and it was assigned by families. All right, your family has this chore, and they would go down and do that chore. Okay, and then they would rotate it around. So each family, each man, head of that household, would come down if he was a Levite and do whatever it was that they were assigned to do. Some of them were assigned as doorkeepers. Some of them were assigned as singers. Some of them were assigned as teachers. There was lots of things that had to be done in the temple and around the temple that needed to be done. So these men, the Levites, were responsible and assigned their courses throughout the temple and throughout the city. They would go around teaching. Okay? Now, it used to be around here in the early days, in the early 1800s, that we had horseback riding preachers that would come around town. Okay? They'd ride a horse and they'd stop in preaching points all around, and they would teach and they would preach, they'd witness, they'd set up churches, they'd baptize folks, and there would be churches established. All right? So those churches would be established. And remember, the first place that we had those horseback riding preachers, this church came out of one of those places down there in Hangendog. All right? And they would set up preaching points. People would begin to come regularly. The preacher would come regularly. He would travel around by horseback, and they'd welcome him. They'd feed him. They'd have him spend the night, whatever. And he would preach to them all day. And they would stay there until it was time to go. And then he'd go to the next point, and the next point, and the next point. So they had horseback riding preachers. And they would help to preach the gospel, especially among the Cherokee during that time. Now, you think about Humphrey Posey. He was helpful in doing that circuit riding preaching. Humphrey Posey and several other Cherokee men that were responsible. Jesse Bushyhead was one of them. that would go around and preach in those places and establish churches and help churches to grow and to prosper. And a lot of the churches that we have today come out from that place that they helped establish the gospel. So now here's Nehemiah setting in things in order. Remember, he's the governor of the city. Okay? He's been appointed governor by the king of Persia, the one that had taken over. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar was the one that had conquered Jerusalem. Everybody remember Babylon, right? Who replaced Babylon, or who conquered Babylon? By remember? This is from the book of Daniel. This is the Colossus. This is the world government systems. Right here, this is Babylon. Okay? Then, this torso right here, the chest area, replaced Babylon, and they're the Medo-Persians. Okay? The Medo-Persians. They formed an alliance, rebelled against Babylon, and they conquered Babylon in one night. Remember that? That night when the Lord wrote on the wall, Mene, Mene, Parpala, Parson. Remember that finger that wrote on the wall there in front of Nebuchadnezzar's grandson? And they couldn't interpret it, didn't know what it meant. Daniel came in and said, look, this very night, you're going to die, king. Your kingdom is rent from you. So that very night, the Medo-Persians found a way to get into that Babylon. And they had big walls. Walls thick enough to race chariots on. Now that's pretty big, isn't it? You think about that, a wall that you could race chariots, that's at least 2 chariots wide. That's a big wall. And they would race chariots on it. But the Medo-Persians figured out how to get in. Anybody remember how they got in? The river gate. Okay, there was a river around the city of Babylon that would flow into the city, and that's their water source. And they bragged that nobody could ever get in there because they had an iron gate across that river where nobody could go in. Well, there was a reward offered by the king. Said, anybody figures out a way to get in, I'm going to make them a general. Well, here's this little old private, raises his hand. Says, sir, won't you just dam the river up? And that's what they did. They dammed the river up, and they walked right in under that gate and walked right in and just took the city in one night. You see, God can change things quick. And Nebuchadnezzar, he was dead, of course, but his grandson had turned over. Remember that night he was partying and using the vessels from God's house to drink to the other gods that they were drinking to, and God said, that's it. This night, your kingdom's required of you. Here comes the Medo-Persians. All right, anybody know who took the Medo-Persians' place? So that would be right here, this area, and that would be the Romans. Okay, the Romans ultimately split into 2 kingdoms, and the 10 toes represent the 10 nations. That would be like our United Nations today. All right, at the end, the 10 toes represent the 10 kings of the that are going to follow the Antichrist in the end times. That's what those 10 toes represent. They're mixed with iron and clay. Anybody know what happens to iron and clay, by the way? When you mix it, it's brittle and it breaks easy. All right? So God's going to break those kingdoms easily. And they're broken by this rock that's cut out by the mountain, and all that has a reference right here. In Zechariah, you'll see where that's, or Daniel, that's where that's seen in Daniel. So now back to Nehemiah. Nehemiah says, now it came to pass when the wall was built, and I had set up the doors, and the porters and the singers and the Levites were appointed. All right? He was getting things in order. Now he knows he can't stay there. He has to go back to Shushan, to the palace, and serve the king. He knows that he still has work to do There's still things civilly that he has to do. So he's going to make sure that everything's set in order before he leaves so that there's no confusion. There's no bickering or fighting going on about who's going to do what. And you know how people are when somebody says, oh, you got to do this. Well, I don't want to do that. I want to do that. You know how that goes. So Nehemiah is going to make a decision for him. Said, this is who's going to do that. This is going to be who does that. And he has the final say. But the whole time he's doing this, remember, in his back are these nobles that don't like him anymore because he called them out for making money. And they're trying to find ways to get in and have him in trouble or killed. So all that's still going on, but Nehemiah is not letting the enemy scare him. And there's a lesson in that for all of us, that we not let the enemy scare us. Don't let the devil defeat you by fear. God is able to protect you and to provide for you and to give you the work to do and then allow you to do that work. Even though there's enemies all around, God can still bless. Now you stop and think about it. What's around us right now as a principality and power of the air? Who is that? A principality and power of the air. God. Not God, but the God of this world. Satan. Okay? The God of this world is Satan. He's not in hell like people make pictures of, that he's down there bobbing with a pitchfork. That's not Satan. Satan and his demons are in the air around us. Spiritually, they're all around us. So we are technically surrounded by our enemies, but God's protecting us. He's taking care of us, watching over us, providing for us, and helping us through this path of life to be saved, to be servants, and to do what it is he would have us to do on our journey towards him. So remember, even though we're surrounded by the enemy, God's still in control. God's still watching out for his people, and God's going to take care of business. God made sure that Israel got back to the promised land exactly when they were supposed to, and that was 70 years later. Jeremiah prophesied how many years it would be before they come back. Daniel read that in Jeremiah and said, I know how long it's going to be. It's going to be 70 years. And to the day, that's when they went back and were restored as a kingdom. So you think about that. God can take a little old nation like Israel, bring them out of Egypt, bring them across the wilderness, take them into the promised land, conquer all their enemies, give them peace and let them sit up. And boy, they were blessed above all nations. And that can happen again. And it's beginning to happen. They became a nation again back in 1948. And they're still God's people. God's still going to use the Israelites. You read Revelations, and you'll see how God still uses Israel in the end times. He still does. He calls out 144,000 preachers. 12,000 out of each tribe are going to be preachers of the gospel during the tribulation period. And they've got the number of God in their foreheads, and they can't be hurt, they can't be damaged, they can't be destroyed, they can't be killed by the Antichrist, even though he wants to. They're protected by God, and we're in the same way. We're protected by God. God has his mark upon us. His seal is within us. The earnest money of the Holy Spirit is within us, sealed in, and he's going to keep us until the day of our appointment, the day of our redemption, which is drawing nigh. All right, so think about that this evening. We'll stop there, and we'll take up with verse 2 next time of Nehemiah chapter 7. All right, let's all stand.